You are listening to the Gritty Podcast, where we talk about all things gritty. If you want to be successful in the mountains, you need to be successful in life too. So they tell Socrates, hey, we're gonna put you to death. No one wants to be confronted with their moral duty.
Yeah.
And he refused to turn his back on that, even if it meant his death. He's widely considered one of the most important and influential individuals in human history. All right, welcome to the Gritty Podcast. I am your host, Brian Call, and I am joined today by my wife, Suzanne, the Gritty Wife.
Thank you.
How are you?
Couldn't be better.
So today, Suzanne has no idea what this podcast is about to be about.
This is very true.
So here we go, babe. I want to talk about Plato's Phaedo. And that's not made up. That's a real...
You're kind of rhyming.
Yeah. Plato's Phaedo. I don't even know how you say Fado exactly. But in this book, or in this writing, I should say, by Plato, Socrates presents his conviction that the soul is immortal and that belief in the immortal soul can give an individual guidance for life. And many of you know, who've listened to the podcast for a long time, we talk about hunting, but we talk about whatever I want to talk about, basically. And I feel like hunting is just one of the things that I do. If you want to be successful in the mountains, you need to be successful in life too. You want to strive for good character and strength and courage and all those things that help you be gritty and tough and determined throughout life. Those things translate into the mountains too. So we're going to get into that. So I'm just going to dive right into this, discussing who these individuals are, what we're dealing with here. So this book is, or this writing is Fado. It's written by Plato, okay? And I'm going to tell you who Plato is. He was an Athenian from Athens, from Greece, and a Greece philosopher during the classical period in ancient Greece, founder of the Platonist school of thought and the academy, the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. He's widely considered one of the most important and influential individuals in human history and the pivotal figure in the history of ancient Greek and Western philosophy, along with his teacher, Socrates.
Right.
So Plato was taught by Socrates and along with his most famous student, Aristotle. So Aristotle was taught by Plato.
Gotcha.
Okay. A lot of the writings we refer to are Plato talking about his teacher.
Right.
And then you have Aristotle later, who was taught by Plato. Correct. Plato has also often been cited as one of the founders of Western religion and spirituality. So I'm going to get into sort of what Plato said, a little background here. And the reason I'm doing that, because I think it lays the foundation for the next podcast that I want to talk about, which is liberty, freedom, individual, personal choice, a lot of the stuff that our nation is founded on. I want to talk about basically the book On Liberty by John Stuart Mills, which I think is very apropos for today, or poignant for today's society, applicable to where we are today,
right.
And important information to know. So I want to get into this. The book theme deals with questions that every thoughtful individual must consider, either by conscious choice or by neglect. Such questions include the following. Is there a God? Is God responsible for all that happens? Is there a basic order to life, or is it random chance? What is the nature of God, and what is the nature of evil? Do absolute standards of good and evil exist? Do choices to do good or evil have consequences? If good and evil are not absolutes, are they determined by circumstances, or are they words without meaning? If good and evil are not absolutes, are they just then is it just
words?
Is it just words then? Is it just your opinion of what's good and his opinion of what's good? Is that just what it means? Mm-hmm. So these are questions that Socrates goes over and over and over in his mind with. Okay, and we consider him one of the greatest philosophers of all time, along with Plato and Aristotle. So Plato's Phaedo and the Divine Comedy serve as a bridge to the next theme applying these lessons to one's own life. Both of these great works were written by noble and just men. Each of these works summarizes civilization at its apex. Now, for those who don't know about the Divine Comedy, that was written by Dante in the time of the Catholic Middle Ages. And he's Italian. And Dante's Divine Comedy, if you don't know the story, read it. But basically, both authors suffered terrible wrongs, Socrates and Dante. Dante died in exile, having been convicted of malfeasance and corruption in office and under a death penalty for not standing trial. And Socrates, the subject of Plato's Phaedo, received the death penalty after being convicted of corruption and treason.
Right.
So both of them, suffered a bad ending, so to speak. Although Socrates, he had plenty of time to run, to flee, to get out of Dodge.
They wanted him to, yeah.
The Athenians kind of wanted him to. They just wanted him to quit teaching what he was teaching, quit saying what he wanted.
Yes.
Even though they had the freedom.
All those things
And even though they had the freedom to say so and all that, basically a group of activists were outraged and they ended up putting him to death. And he's like, yeah, I ain't going to run. I'm old. This is probably a blessing. I've had a good life. Talks to Plato, and then he drinks his poison and he dies. So, which is a great story as well. Read Socrates, read Plato's Republic. Anyway, so Socrates, let me get into this. For Homer and the great writers of Athenian tragedy, you guys have seen the Achilles and the Homers.
Odyssey.
Yeah, and all that kind of stuff. They wrote all these great stories at this time. In these books, or in these stories, the soul had only a shadowy existence in the afterlife. But 5th century Greece saw the development of a more profound concept of the immortality of the soul. Now, I'm just telling you what these philosophers came up with and what this is about. And you'll kind of get at it later, whether you're religious or not religious. As he said earlier, these are questions you contend with, whether you choose to or not in life, whether you consciously address them or don't. And in either way, you're sort of making a choice. For Socrates, the belief in the immortality of the soul was the ultimate question. Plato portrays its centrality to the mission of Socrates in the Phaedo. In this dialogue, with death imminent, Socrates spends his last hours pursuing with his students the question of whether the soul lives forever. For Socrates, only the immortality of the soul gives a cause to accept consequences for our actions. So if there's no point, if the body and the soul just dies together,
and that's it,
and there is no soul and it's over and it's all done, then there's really no right or wrong. There's no consequences. Right. There's no meaning.
Yeah.
So he says, the immortality of the soul alone is the ultimate proof of absolute values, including truth, justice, and beauty. So he's saying if the soul lives forever, then everything matters. Truth, justice, and beauty. Yet, after a life of searching for truth through logic and reason, Socrates comes to the final acceptance that the immortality of the soul cannot be proven. It can only be accepted as a matter of faith. Interesting, right? He's like, after all the ways he tried to break it down, at the end of the day, he's like, there's no logical way to prove it.
Right.
You can't, this isn't a thing that can be proven. It has to be accepted as a matter of faith. It says, but fair is the prize of that acceptance. That's a quote. Plato shaped all of philosophical tradition, and the Phaedo may well rank as his most influential dialogue and the supreme legacy of Socrates. Socrates was the greatest teacher in history. His trial in 399 BC, 400 years before Christ, was a product of the war between Athens and Sparta. Plato's Apology is a record of the speech that Socrates gave before the Athenian jury in his trial for corrupting youth and believing in new and different divinities rather than in the gods of Athens. So what Socrates was doing is he was out teaching people other gods that weren't the gods of Athens. Like, there's this possibility and there's that god, and these people have this god, and he thinks this and teaches that. And each of these kind of stories about God, like, expand people's ideas of what God is, and they all bring different things to the table. And the gods of Athens, he's like, there's others too. and that enrages the public.
Right.
And so he goes before the Athenian jury, and the book Plato's Apology is a record of that speech. Or I don't know if it's not really a book, but it's the writings of it. Socrates did not excuse himself, but spoke the truth. His apology was a profound statement of the idea of freedom of conscience. This is what's interesting. Plato or Socrates is sitting there, and he's told, "Hey, you're enraging people. It says you're indoctrinating the youth with these other gods that aren't the gods we approve of." Right. He gets some public outrage. Some people say, "Okay, we're not going to put up with this anymore." And based on public outrage, they decide, "Okay, we're going to have to get rid of you." So they tell Socrates, "Hey, we're gonna put you to death if you don't shut up and stop this thing."
Right.
And then they tell him, "Okay, we're gonna put you to death," but they give him plenty of time to leave, to go to another city, to go do whatever he wants, and he can certainly get out of there if he wants to, and he still stays. And they give him like every chance in the book, and he has a chance. He can decide, okay, I'm just going to avoid this punishment. They don't want to do this anyway because he's so popular. It'll cause some serious outrage at the same time. So he has a thing where he's kind of like, yeah, I'm not going to deny my conscience. I'm going to speak, and I'm going to say what I think, and I'm going to follow my conscience. And he said, what makes him different than all other men, most other men, was that he always followed his inner conscience, like the truth that he felt. He refused to turn his back on that, even if it meant his death. And he felt like dying in this manner was actually probably good. He'd lived a long, full life. Life expectancy wasn't really long. It was starting to go downhill from there. He's like, and there's a lot of logic and reason in his decision. He's like, nah, this is a great way to go. Don't mourn for me. I'm pretty stoked on how this all turned out.
Yeah.
And it's an incredible story. So in Plato's Phaedo, Socrates presents his conviction that the soul is immortal, and that belief in the immortal soul can give an individual guidance for life. Basically saying like, hey, if you believe that there is something more to just this existence, that there's an immortal soul, like there's a lot of value and guidance, gives you guidance. Socrates, like Jesus, never wrote a book. His student Plato left a series of dialogues in which Plato says the highest tribute to his teacher by putting his ideas into the mouth of Socrates, thereby implying that without Socrates, Plato, the intellectual, would not have existed. It has been said that all of philosophy has been a series of footnotes to Plato, and that Socrates was his intellectual father. Socrates was a true philosopher, a seeker after truth, and a lover of wisdom. He asked such questions as, what is justice? What is piety? What is God? What is good government? This questioning brought Socrates into conflict with the citizens of Athens. The Athenians wanted to eliminate Socrates because he forced them to think about these issues.
Yeah.
No one wants to be confronted with their moral duty.
Yeah. Maybe you should rethink what you're doing.
Or maybe there's some holes in your current logic, you know?
Yeah.
People don't like to be forced or forced to or compelled to think about responsibility. Period. Responsibility is, adopting responsibility, picking up your cross, going through the efforts of doing hard things. All those things bring meaning and value to a man and a woman's life, a person's life. Rejecting those rejecting responsibility gives you the permission to do whatever you want and engage in whatever, but it also eliminates purpose and meaning.
Right.
And so you don't get to have your cake and eat it too.
Right.
You have to decide, hey, am I going to be the sort of person that accepts responsibility, takes on responsibility, and that believes that everything I do matters and really fulfill that in a lifetime? Or am I going to be the person that's like, none of that matters. It's all subjective. It's all your opinion versus my opinion. I don't really have a lot of responsibility. And you know what? I'm going to chill.
Yeah.
And there's with that comes very little meaning. Like, what's the point then? Why are you here? Is there any point?
Why are you working hard? Why do you have goals? Where are you going?
It says, The Phaedo is a dialogue that takes place on the day that Socrates will carry out his own execution by drinking a glass of hemlock. Fado is a non-Athenian who is one of the students of Socrates. At the beginning of the dialogue, the jailer gives Socrates instructions, and Socrates asks for someone to take his wife, Xanthippe, home. The students of Socrates ask him why he has recently been writing a hymn to Apollo and verse versions of Aesop's fables. He indicates that in his dreams, the muses had told him to make music and poetry. When he attempted to write poetry, he realized that his search for truth was his way of making poetry. In obtaining his wisdom, he learned that his search for truth was what he should have been doing all along, and that he had done what he was meant to do. Crito, a student of Socrates, then asks why Socrates appears happy in his present situation. After all, Socrates has been condemned to death. Socrates states that he is happy because he has lived his whole life wanting to die and preparing to die. He believes that a person who spends his life searching for truth and wisdom is doing nothing but preparing to die.
I wonder if that's really the word they used, happy.
I don't know. Good question. Continuing, it says, death is the moment when his soul is liberated from the trials of the body, and the soul of a person who has prepared for death will go to the bliss of union with God, which is cause for happiness. The students of Socrates next ask him why he did not kill himself. Socrates explains that suicide is not an option. A person is the slave of God and must prepare for the moment when God wants him to die. The students wonder how Socrates can say that the body is a prison that keeps the soul enmeshed. Socrates says that the cares and concerns of the body, such as hunger and fatigue, prevent an individual from pursuing truth and wisdom. The more a person can do to rid himself of his desires and bodily concerns, the purer his soul will become. Socrates is then asked to answer the following questions. How do you know that your soul will continue after death and that actions have consequences? How do you know whether your life spent in the pursuit of wisdom had meaning? Socrates replies that the immortality of the soul is the basis for everything and is attested by the existence of absolutes, such as absolute truth, justice, good, and beauty. Absolute beauty, for example, occurs in heaven, and it exists and is true, even if every person on earth denies it. Socrates says that people are born understanding the concept of these absolutes. Therefore, the absolutes can exist only if the soul existed before the body, and if these ideas were imprinted on the mind in heaven. Thus, the soul existed before we were born and will exist after we pass away. So these men are struggling with some ideas. They're, C.S. Lewis talks about the awe and how every civilization, since the dawn of time, some evolutionary biologists and scientists have noticed the same thing. Like, religion is an instinct. It's a human instinct. Like, everyone kind of has the instinct in them. There's like this, the awe that you experience when you're in the presence of beauty or a sunrise, or there's this kind of spiritual feeling, basically, that there's some kind of instinct, that there's something deeper, more. You feel it when you hear some kind of music that's just moves you. And so these kind of experiences, he's saying, like, some of these absolute beauty, some of these things, you kind of just know they're instinctive, they're there, they're sort of a testimony that there's something more, that this means more, that life is more. The next question is, if the soul existed before you were born, how do you know that it will not die when you die? Socrates says that the soul is immortal because it gives one life. Absolute life must be the opposite of absolute death, and no absolute can admit its absolute opposite into it. Figure that one out.
Read that again.
So one of the students says, if the soul existed before you were born, how do you know that it won't die when you die? If it was here before,
oh, right.
but now you die. He says the soul is immortal because it gives one life. He's saying, like, well, what he says next is interesting. Absolute life must be the opposite of absolute death, and no absolute can admit its absolute opposite into it. I think what he's saying is, if it was absolute before you came here, it has to stay absolute because that's what it is.
Right.
Therefore, the soul must continue and it must be imperishable.
So we're saying there's something beyond life here.
There was something before and something that comes next. Yeah.
Right.
Which is kind of what Dante's Inferno or Divine Comedy, both of those books kind of say the same sort of things. Which was a different philosopher from a different time during the classic Catholic period, Dante. Socrates' students indicate that they believe him, but that they do not know whether he has persuaded them. Socrates states that he has come to understand that belief in the ultimate truth is just that, a belief. One cannot prove that the soul is immortal or that good or bad actions have consequences. One must make a leap of faith to believe it. He says, if you do, fair is the prize and great is the hope. And it is in that hope that I can go happily to my death. Interesting. He's saying you can't prove it. This isn't an act of proving. This is an act of faith. In the book 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson, there's an interesting quote that he has where he talks about telling the truth, or at least don't lie. There's a chapter dedicated to truth and what a lie is. Like, it's long and it's deep. And what it does is he talks about honesty with oneself and the world around you. In Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday, he made this quote. I've said it a million times. I'll say it again. He says, ego is the thing that keeps you from having a true and honest connection to the world around you. Or your pride is the thing that keeps you from having a true and honest connection to the world around you. And I think what that means is if you have pride, if you think you know it all, then you're kind of in a place of delusion.
Yeah.
Like nothing's your fault. You're always a victim. It's always someone else. Like you can't improve because you don't have a true and honest connection to reality. You have a pride. You're seeing it through the lens of pride, which says you didn't do anything wrong. You're perfect. The sun shines everywhere you walk. You're a paragon of virtue. Nothing about you is wrong. It's something else. Well, that keeps you from being truly connected to the world because that's not real. You actually suck and you have all sorts of problems and issues.
I think it also stops you from looking inward at like, oh, this situation's happening. Maybe part of it's me.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. That keeps you from being able to self-improve.
Right.
Keeps you from growth. So you're the same person now as you are 20 years from now because you lost a true and honest connection to reality, to yourself, to who you or what you really are, your true abilities and potential in today's moment. So you live a life where you didn't achieve anything because you were constantly not taking accountability for anything. So you never grew, you never changed, you never developed, you never became anything.
Right.
So this whole thing about where he's talking about where you can't prove it, Peterson says at one point in 12 Rules for Life, he says, I don't really know if telling the truth every single time leads to, I mean, like, there's no way for me to prove it to you that telling the truth leads someplace great. He kind of says it's an act of faith. Like, you have to try it and then see what happens. So instead of lying, instead of making up excuses, instead of doing what's easy, what's expedient in the moment to get your way, only use your words for truth and honesty. And as you strive to do that, nobody's perfect, but as you strive to do that, then you become the sort of person that has good things coming to them throughout life.
That reminds me of that Jim Carrey movie where he can't tell a lie.
Liar, liar. Right.
It destroys his life.
Right. He makes this comment in the book where he says, if you really, really want to have an adventure, you want to have a true life adventure, tell the truth. Tell the truth.
Yeah.
Always tell the truth. He's like, when you lie, you kind of lie because you have a goal in mind and you know where it's going to take you. That's not a mystery. That's not exciting. That's not an adventure. That's you bending the fabric of reality just to try to make it do what you want it to do. But the truth always has a way of rising up and bubbling up.
Yeah.
And it bites you in the ass later. And so his thing is, tell the truth. You never know where that might lead. Like, you don't know. You're like, okay, I'm going on faith. I'm going to go ahead and be as honest as I can all the time. Okay, here we go. I'm throwing this out there. And they might not like what I have to say. Yeah. And all of a sudden, you're on a ride, man. There's an adventure, especially in the world we live in today that lacks authenticity and realness. Man, if you can harness that and just be straight all the time as much as possible, that's a ride. That's an adventure. And that's kind of what he's saying here too, Socrates. He's saying, hey, that I can't prove it, that there's a soul and that we live forever. I can't. It's an act of faith. But up here in quotes, there's that statement where he says something about the trade is worth it.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. It's in quotation.
But fair is the prize.
Yeah, fair is the prize.
But fair is the prize. He says, Socrates comes to the final acceptance that the immortality of the soul cannot be proven. It can only be accepted as a matter of faith. But fair is the prize of that acceptance. He's saying, do it. It's worth it, because if you do it, it leads this way. Mm-hmm. If you don't accept that the soul is immortal as a matter of faith, then the path leads this way. Mm-hmm. And he's saying it's worth it. It's worth it. You have a lot of people who will disagree with this. You'll have people who are anti-God or just atheist or agnostic that will say, you're just making stuff up. That's a fair argument. And Plato is saying, I can't prove it. You can't disprove it either.
Right.
What's interesting is what he's saying is it's worth it though. Like Peterson says, tell the truth and go on that ride, try it out and see where it takes you. It's the
same with faith.
And in the New Testament, Christ says something similar, where he says, if you want to know if it's true, like do what I'm saying and what the Father who sent me said to say. Like try it. Mm-hmm. If you kind of want to know it, if it's the right path or if it's real, live it and see what happens. And I think that's
a chance. Yeah.
I think that's that ultimate ride, like Peterson's talking about too. Same thing that is coming here with Socrates. So let me find my place again.
Yeah.
Finally, the student asks Socrates what he believes the afterlife will be like. Socrates, who had been convicted by the Athenians of blasphemy, believed that each person had a god inside of him, a daemon, that is, a good spirit or conscience. That conscience accompanies the soul to the underworld. The soul of a person who has lived in pursuit of truth goes with his conscience to the underworld. The daemon of a person, the soul or the god, who has lived an evil life must drag that person's soul down. When a person reaches the underworld, his soul will be judged by God. Those who have done evil deeds are thrown into a deep fiery pit. This is just like Dante's Inferno. Those who have done bad deeds in a moment of anger or desperation are thrown into a great lake, where they float around until their victims who stand on the banks forgive them. Those who have not done anything evil, but who have not purified their souls, will flit around until they are reborn as other creatures. Those souls who have spent their lives purifying themselves in the pursuit of wisdom are free forever, and they go to heaven and are joined with God and know only happiness and bliss and purity. Now, sometimes these kind of afterlife things, descriptions are just truly hated by your extremely logical and your reason thinkers and whatnot. But these things are often not literal. These are concepts, ideas of like imagery of what it is. Sometimes the literal story isn't true, but the idea behind it is more true than the story itself. Mm-hmm. And in this case, he's saying the worst of the worst, they're in hell.
Yeah.
They're in a fiery pit. Those that did this other stuff that weren't great, they're in a lake and they're going to sit there until the people that they wronged forgive them and pull them out of the lake. It's symbolic. It's imagery. It doesn't even have to be literal. It's the concept behind it, the idea of what happens after you're gone. isn't necessarily literal. And then he says, those who have done anything evil but never like did anything great. They weren't mean people, but they didn't live purified lives and purified souls.
They didn't live for other people, just themselves.
Yeah, but they didn't hurt anyone.
Right.
He's like, they'll just get another chance. They'll just flit around and be reborn as something else. But those souls who have spent their lives purifying themselves in the pursuit of wisdom are free forever, and they go to heaven and are joined. And it's a concept. It's an idea. Like, because of that purity and that growth and where they went, they become truly blissful.
Join with God. They're pure.
In their purity. Thus, Socrates believes in consequences for good and bad actions and knows that God cares about good and evil. All people make their choices and will pay for them. The jailer makes his presence known, and Socrates says the jailer has been good to him. The jailer then prepares the poison. After drinking the poison and beginning to feel its effects, Socrates says that Crito should offer a rooster to Aesculapius, a Greek god, the god of healing and health, for healing him of earthly cares and the desires of his body. Thus, with his last breath, Socrates indicts the Athenian democracy that put him to death and shows a more profound belief in gods than those who had accused him. Socrates dies, and Phaedo says, that was the end of the man who of all the men of our day was the best, the most just, the finest man who ever lived. So that's the book. It just, that's the story, the writings. That is food for thought. It's a question of individual conscience, individual liberty to live how you want to live. And he's saying it matters. Everything you do matters. And that's the path to take. That there is good and evil. And it's absolute. Interesting story. So check that out if you want to learn more about it. I think sometimes people don't spend enough time reading some of these books, and it seems like nowadays they want to take all this kind of discussion out of schools and replace it with something far less meaningful and shallow.
Yeah, I remember reading these things in high school. I don't know if they still do, but
no. No, our schools are garbage right now, and they're garbage. They're trash heaps, and it's disappointing. They're teaching the social justice things. They're teaching postmodern stuff, and I think that there were a lot of great people who lived before us that we should spend a little more time, great thinkers, studying and learning from. So anyway, food for thought. Next podcast we're going to do is On Liberty by John Stuart Mills. I'm going to get into that, and I'm going to go over, it ties in a little bit with this book that we went over. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. Use the code GRITTY at Mountain Ops and check out Stealthy and Peaks. Use the code GRITTY there. Get yourself some trekking poles, gaiters. Right now, Black Ovis has the Peak skaters in stock. You can go to Black Ovis, pick those up, use the code GRITTY, get a deal. And that's it. Thanks for tuning in. Stay gritty.